Flight attendant boots 3 kids off a plane unaware their dad owns the airline. I've never been big on long flights, but this one seems special. The first-class section of the Horizon Airways plane going from Chicago to Los Angeles was amazing. Big comfy seats covered in soft leather, fancy glasses of red wine on trays, and a peaceful vibe, so quiet I could hear the ice clinking in a businessman's drink a few rows up. I leaned back, sipped my hot coffee, and figured this trip would be a breeze. Boy, was I off the mark. Over by the aisle, 3 kids grabbed my attention. Triplets, all about 13 years old, looking curious and full of energy. Jaden Harris, a tall kid with a calm vibe, was double-checking his seatbelt. Kyla Harris, with her curly hair pulled back neatly, played with a shiny new pair of headphones. And Malik Harris, the smallest of the bunch, had his nose pressed to the window, staring wide-eyed at the runway lights glowing in the fading day. They didn't seem like the usual first-class types, not because of their simple t-shirts and jeans, but because they looked both nervous and thrilled at the same time. I don't like jumping to conclusions about people, but not everyone around me feels that way. A guy in his 50s, a few seats ahead, peeked at them and gave a little sneer. A lady decked out in shiny jewelry leaned over to mumble something to her husband, too quiet to catch, but loud enough to make the air feel weird. People started throwing sideways glances and hushed opinions around the cabin. Then, right on time, the head flight attendant, Cassandra Cassie Monroe, showed up. She marched straight over to the triplets, her face blank and stiff, like she was ready to handle some troublemakers. "Hey, I need to see your tickets again," she said, her voice flat but with a hint of doubt. Jaden looked up, caught off guard but staying polite. He grabbed his phone and pulled up their tickets. "Here they are," he said, showing her the screen. Kyla sat still, looking puzzled, while Malik turned away from the window to check on his sister, obviously confused about what was going on. I looked around. No one else in the whole place had to show their tickets. Things started feeling off. This wasn't just a little slip-up. This was someone making assumptions. Has something unfair like this ever happened where you were? What would you do about it? Leave a comment below and tell me what city you're tuning in from. My coffee didn't taste so good anymore. The mood in the cabin had gotten thick and uncomfortable. Jaden, keeping his cool, pointed at his phone. "Our tickets are legit. See for yourself," he said, his tone steady but nice. Cassie took the phone, staring at it like she thought it might be fake. But instead of saying they were fine, she gave a small, smug smile, her eyes flashing with a chilly confidence. "Sorry, kids, but your names aren't showing up in our records," she said, acting all official but not meaning it. "Looks like a mix-up. I need you 3 to move over so we can sort this out." I scrunched my eyebrows. A mix-up, or was she stirring up trouble on purpose? Malik held onto his armrest, trying to stay calm, while Kyla murmured, "Why are we the only ones who have to move? Everyone else is already buckled in." Cassie crossed her arms, brushing them off. "It's just how we do things. If your tickets are good, you'll be back soon, but right now, step aside." Quiet chatter spread through the fancy cabin. Some folks acted like they didn't notice, staring at their little TV screens. Others peeked over quickly but kept their mouths shut, like it wasn't their problem. Then a snarky voice broke through the quiet. "First class isn't for everybody, kid." I swung my head around. It was Robert Grayson, a guy in his 50s sprawled out in his seat wearing a pricey suit and a flashy Rolex. His words dripped with a know-it-all attitude. A couple of people snickered, quietly agreeing. Nobody spelled it out, but I could tell what they were thinking. These 3 kids didn't fit in here. Kyla dropped her eyes, holding her seatbelt tight. But Jaden didn't budge. "We don't need you telling us where we fit," he fired back, staring right at Grayson with a steady, bold look. Grayson just laughed it off and turned away, but Cassie wasn't letting it go. She hit the button on her radio, her voice sharp. "Security, I've got 3 uncooperative passengers in first class who need to be taken off." I let out a quick huff. This was getting out of hand fast. More people started noticing. Some frowned, but most stayed out of it. Jaden said again, his voice lower, "Uncooperative? We're just sitting where we're supposed to." Cassie ignored him. She pressed the radio button again, like she was done listening. Kyla started shaking a little, grabbing her brother's sleeve. Malik glanced around, his eyes showing both mad and mixed-up feelings. I checked out the cabin, hoping someone, anyone, would speak up or step in, but nobody did. That's when it clicked. If no one else was going to do something, I had to. I took a big breath, put my coffee down, and reached for the call button. If Cassie Monroe thought she could push these 3 kids out of their spots without a fight, she'd picked the wrong day. Do you think this was really just a goof-up? If you do, comment why below. If not, let me know where you're watching from. The air in first class was buzzing with stress. Some folks whispered to each other, while others pretended nothing was happening. A handful, though, watched like it was a live show unfolding right in front of them. One thing was obvious: this had gone way too far. Jaden stayed chill, but I could see his hands squeezing the armrest, his fingers digging in. He wasn't about to leave. Kyla and Malik scooted closer together, Kyla's big eyes full of worry, Malik's hands balled up tight. Then a voice piped up, making everything even messier. Excuse me, but these seats are ours." I turned around. An older couple, Gary and Linda Voss, walked up, waving paper tickets. The guy, with slicked-back gray hair and a sharp suit, looked like he flew fancy all the time. The lady next to him, in a classy dress, gave the triplets a sorry look, but didn't stick up for them. Cassie jumped on it, grinning like she'd won something. "Thanks for sorting out this confusion," she said, spinning toward Jaden. "See? It's clear now. You're in the wrong spots. Security's coming to walk you out so we can get this flight going." I was floored. What was going on here? Was this just dumb luck, or was something sneaky cooking? Jaden popped up, his voice strong. "No way. Our tickets are for first class. Our seats can't be the same as theirs." Gary Voss shook his head. "We've got real tickets from the airline, solid proof." Jaden faced Cassie. "Did you even look at the system?" Cassie crossed her arms, dodging his question. "No need to dig deeper," she snapped. "If you won't get up, security's my next call." Kyla clung to her brother's sleeve harder, whispering, "I don't want to leave." Her voice wobbled. It hit me. This wasn't a fluke. It was planned. I scanned the room, wondering if anyone else picked up on it too. Then I spotted her, Aisha Patel, a young vlogger a few rows back, holding her phone up, filming it all without a sound. She didn't say anything, but her sharp eyes told me she'd seen stuff like this before. She knew something was fishy. Things heated up fast. 2 security guards stepped into first class. One big guy with a crisp uniform and a take-charge attitude. The other smaller, but just as serious. Cassie pointed at them. "These 3 need to go. Now." Jaden stood tall, stepping in front of Kyla and Malik. "We're not moving until you explain this for real." The bigger guard moved closer, his voice tough. "We don't want to make this hard. Come with us." I could tell Jaden was fighting to stay cool. He knew if he got loud, they'd use it against him. But I saw a spark in his eyes, a grit that wouldn't quit. I felt a knot of frustration twisting inside me. This was flat out wrong. Then Aisha Patel got up. "Hold on, I think something's off here," she said, her voice ringing out. "I've got this all on video. Why not let them talk before you haul them off?" The whole cabin went quiet as a graveyard. People's eyes darted around. Some grabbed their phones. Things were shifting. For the first time, Cassie hesitated. I saw her hands tighten, her fingers turning pale. She didn't see that coming. Jaden took the opening, pulled out his phone, hit a number, and held it to his ear. "Dad," he said, calm but solid, "they're trying to kick us off. Someone's messed with everything." Nobody in the cabin knew who he'd dialed, but I did. And here's the thing. If Cassie Monroe thought she could shove these 3 kids out of their seats without paying a price, she'd made a giant mistake. Marcus Harris wasn't a name anyone here would recognize, but I knew it well. If anybody could turn this mess around in a heartbeat, it was him. A big shot in the airline game, the guy who owned Horizon Airways, but he kept a low profile when he flew regular flights. I peeked at Cassie. She still had her cool, bossy look going, but I caught a tiny twitch in her eyes. Maybe, way down deep, she had a hunch this was slipping away from her. Cassie spun around quick, heading over to the Voss couple. She bent down and muttered something too soft to hear, but I saw their eyes meet, a quiet agreement passing between them. Aisha, still filming on the down low, tilted her phone a bit to catch every move they made. What was Cassie hiding? I couldn't pin it down, but it was plain as day. This older pair wasn't just some random folks caught in a snafu. Back in Chicago, Marcus Harris was in his slick office, high up in a glass building. He was in the middle of a meeting with bigwigs talking about new plane routes when Jaden's call buzzed in. He sat up straight, his voice dropping low and serious. "Tell me that again." Jaden didn't skip a beat. He laid it all out, how they were told to get out of their seats and how the Voss couple popped up claiming the same spots. Marcus shut his eyes for a second, holding back the anger bubbling up. This wasn't a glitch. This was a setup. Without a word, he called up William Dawson, the head honcho at Horizon Airways. In less than half a minute, calls started flying everywhere, bouncing through offices, picking up speed like crazy. Then one last call went straight to the plane's captain. Out of nowhere, Cassie's phone buzzed. I couldn't read the message, but her face told the story. Her eyebrows scrunched up, her jaw locked tight, her hand squeezing the phone like she might break it. I'm no expert at reading people, but I've seen enough tense moments to know when someone's just gotten hit with bad news. Real bad news. Cassie flicked her eyes toward Jaden, not all high and mighty anymore, but with a flicker of worry. Kyla, still holding her brother's sleeve, let out a little breath, a spark of hope lighting up her face. Aisha, sitting close by, leaned over and whispered, "She just got told what to do by the big bosses, huh?" I gave a slow nod, keeping my eyes on Cassie. She wasn't running the show anymore. Everybody noticed the change. Robert Grayson, the cocky guy who'd poked fun at Jaden earlier, scrunched his forehead, picking up that something weird was going down. People who'd been quiet before leaned in, watching every little thing. The real story was starting to come out. Cassie sucked in a big breath, stood up straighter, and tried to act calm again, but I could tell she was rattled. She grabbed her radio and spoke, her voice shakier than before. "Captain Monroe, I gotta check on 3 first-class passengers again. Maybe there's been a mistake." The cabin got super quiet. Nobody missed how her tone switched up. Aisha gave a tiny grin, nudging me. She's scrambling to fix this. I nodded. She could try to patch things up, but it was too late now. When the real power talks, the truth can't hide. This wasn't Cassie's game anymore. I didn't know exactly what Marcus Harris had up his sleeve next, but one thing was for sure. This flight wasn't going to keep rolling like nothing happened. And after all this drama, someone was going to face the music. The vibe in first class had never been so heavy. Everyone could see Cassie starting to crack, a little sweat on her forehead, her eyes darting to her phone like she was begging for help from upstairs. She was waiting for someone to bail her out, but she didn't get it. The rules had flipped. A few rows back, Aisha, who'd been secretly filming since the start, posted her first clip online. In 3 minutes flat, people were commenting like crazy. Why'd they only pick on these 3 kids? Is this a slip-up or on purpose? Is the airline going to say anything? Aisha checked her phone. Her video was blowing up. The hashtag Horizon Justice was taking over Twitter. The world was watching, but the big surprise was still coming. A guy stepped out, his uniform neat as a pin, his face tight, Captain James Jim Monroe, Cassie's husband. The way he looked around the cabin, you could tell he was totally in the dark. Cassie turned to him, her body stiff, trying to sound all business. "We've got a small problem with some passengers," she said, but she didn't sound sure of herself anymore. Jim didn't answer right away. His eyes landed on Jaden, Kyla, and Malik, then checked out how everyone else was acting. Something was wrong, and he could feel it. "Who told these kids to get out of their seats?" he asked, his voice hard. Jaden gave Kyla's hand a little squeeze, but he didn't have to say a word. The quiet in the cabin said it all. Jim's frown got deeper as he looked at Cassie. "Did you look at their tickets?" Cassie opened her mouth, but before she could fudge the truth, her radio beeped. She froze up. I watched her face go pale as a voice came through. "Passengers Jaden, Kyla, and Malik Harris stay on this flight. Nobody's allowed to kick them off." The whole first-class section went silent, like someone hit the mute button. I saw Robert Grayson, the guy who teased Jaden before, take a big gulp of his whiskey, his smug look gone. But the real shocker was still on its way. Another voice crackled over the radio, this one from someone even higher up. "Here's the deal. The older couple who said they lost their tickets before this flight, they never booked seats. They're fakes." The cabin went nuts. The two people Cassie swore were the real deal was actually crooks, teaming up with airline workers to snag free spots. And it wasn't their first rodeo. Jaden's jaw got tight. "So you're telling me they didn't even have real tickets?" Jim Monroe's face turned stone cold as he faced Cassie. "You knew about this, didn't you?" Cassie didn't say a word. Her face went blank, her brain racing for a way out. Malik looked at Kyla, whispering, "They tried to ditch us just to give our seats away?" His words landed like a loud bang in the cabin. Cassie opened her mouth, maybe to argue, maybe to make excuses, but before she could get it out, Aisha stepped up, holding her phone high. "Everybody needs to check this out." On her screen was a close-up video, Cassie whispering to the Voss couple before they claimed the seats, looking around all nervous like she didn't want to get caught. And the worst part, her voice saying clear as day, "Don't worry, just do what I say." Cassie turned to Jim, but he wasn't looking at her like a husband anymore. He was looking at her like a boss staring down someone who'd screwed up bad. "Cassie," he said slow, "did you keep this from me?" She didn't answer, but not saying anything was enough. The cabin stayed super still. Some folks checked their phones, others swapped nervous looks. Jaden let out a breath. "So you knew the whole time and still tried to boot us?" Cassie swallowed hard. "I was just doing my job," she said, but nobody was buying it this time. In 10 minutes, Asia's video was everywhere. Tons of views, heaps of comments. "This isn't a mistake, it's a trick." "How often does this happen? That flight attendant's gotta pay." Robert Grayson quietly put his drink down, his face red with shame. For once, he couldn't face the kid he'd made fun of. Jim let out a sigh, hitting his radio. "Tell the main office, we've got a big problem to deal with when we land." The ones who'd been in charge were falling apart now. Jaden, Kyla, and Malik weren't on their own anymore, but this wasn't done yet. "What do you think's next? Will Cassie get what's coming, or will things turn out fair? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from." The air in first class felt heavier than ever. The truth was out there, but that didn't mean it was all wrapped up. The Voss couple, the fakes, who'd just been caught, shrank down in their seats, their eyes bouncing around like they wanted to bolt. Then it all blew up. A guy in a nice suit slammed his hand on the table. "What's this nonsense?" he yelled, sounding furious. "We shelled out big bucks for these tickets, and this is what we get? A cheap scam?" The quiet chatter turned into loud, angry voices. A lady with blonde hair crossed her arms, her words biting. "I knew something wasn't right. Why'd they only bug the kids about tickets? Now it makes sense." Robert Grayson sat there, saying nothing, his hand gripping his whiskey glass so hard his fingers turned white. His cocky grin was long gone, swapped for an awkward squirm. He wouldn't look at Jaden. Meanwhile, the Voss couple started freaking out. Gary got up, his face white as a sheet. We were just doing what we were told," he stuttered. "We didn't know." "They said our seats had a problem." Linda hugged her purse tight, her hands shaking, trying to edge away, but a younger guy blocked her. "You're not sneaking off that easy," he said, cool and calm. Every eye locked on Cassie. The take charge flight attendant from before was history. Her mouth twitched open, but nothing came out. I could see it. She was hunting for a way to wiggle out of this, but her face showed she was stuck. She had no excuses left. Aisha stepped closer, holding up her phone. "You knew the whole time, huh?" she said, her voice steady. On her screen was hard proof. Cassie whispering to the Voss couple before they made their move, sneaking a worried look around, and her voice caught saying, "Don't worry, just stick with me." Cassie backed up, her lips quivering. "It's a mix-up," she mumbled. "I was just following the rules." Jaden stood up. This time he wasn't worked up or lost. He was cool as ice. I could see the relief in his eyes because the facts were out. "No," he said loud and clear. "You weren't following rules. You wanted us gone so someone else could take our seats." Kyla grabbed his hand. Malik stood next to him, the three of them standing strong together. Things were finally swinging their way. But the other passengers weren't cool with Cassie's lame excuse. An older guy with a fancy vibe in the front row jumped up, pointing at her. "We paid for top-notch service," he barked, "not to watch airline people team up with fakes and rip off real passengers." Another lady shook her head. "What's the airline gonna do about this mess?" Cassie had no place to hide. Jim Monroe turned to his wife, but he wasn't seeing her as family anymore. He was looking at her like her boss, and the letdown in his eyes hit hard. "Cassie," he said, slow and steady, "you lied to me and broke airline rules." She started to argue, but before she could get a word out, Jim turned away and grabbed his radio. "Get a hold of management. We've got a serious problem to fix when we hit the ground." Cassie sucked in a sharp breath. That one line was like a nail in the coffin for her job. Aisha grinned a little, leaning my way. "Bet she didn't see this coming when she started this." I chuckled softly. "Nope, but the worst is still ahead." Then everything went quiet. I saw Cassie's hands ball up. She knew it was over. Jaden stood there, not gloating or grinning, but sure that fairness had won out. Kyla and Malik gave their first little smiles since we took off. People kept talking among themselves, but they all agreed on one thing. Cassie Monroe was done. For the first time ever, she wasn't calling the shots. And I knew when we landed, it'd only get rougher for her. First class wasn't anywhere close to normal. Everyone who'd seen this whole mess go down sat there stunned, muttering to each other. The anger and shock in their eyes all pointed at one person, Cassie Monroe. She'd been the one running things on this flight. Now she was just another cheat who got found out. I kept an eye on her. The bold attitude was gone. Her lips pinched tight. Her hands squeezed into fists like she was still trying to figure a way out. But I knew the deal. There was no running from this. Then a voice cut through the thick quiet. "Cassandra Monroe, get to the cockpit right now." Everything froze. Nobody said a peep. I caught a quick flash of panic in Cassie's eyes. She turned toward the cockpit, but her feet didn't budge. She knew what was waiting. Jaden still held Kyla and Malik's hands, but now there was no scared look, no stress, just a soft, happy grin, not about winning bragging rights, but finally getting things right. People lifted their phones again, filming this part. They knew they were seeing the moment. Control flipped. Cassie moved forward, trying hard to look steady, but I could tell her shoulders were stiff, her breathing quick and short. She knew this wasn't a regular check-in. When she walked in, Captain Jim Monroe was already standing by the controls, looking at her with no feeling, no backup in his eyes. He wasn't there to save her. He was there to see her crash. Then a deep, strong voice boomed through the radio. "Cassandra Monroe." She sucked in a fast breath, almost choking. "You could have fixed this. Instead, you misused your power." Real fear showed up on Cassie's face for the first time. It was Marcus Harris. He didn't have to yell, didn't have to scare her, didn't even need to be there. Just his name was enough to shake things up big time. "I heard it all," he said, steady but tough. "I saw the video. I watched you mess with my kids." Every word hit like a punch. Cassie swallowed, but she couldn't fight back. Jim stood there quiet, looking at his wife with clear disappointment. Marcus kept going, his voice heavier, like he was picking each word carefully. I gave you a shot. You could have checked their tickets instead of kicking 3 innocent kids out. You could have owned up before this got wild, but you didn't. Then he dropped the hammer. Now you're going to deal with what comes next. Cassie didn't move, her hands shaking just a bit. She wanted to talk, to find some way to explain, but there was nothing left. She hadn't just tangled with 3 random kids, she'd messed with Marcus Harris's family, one of the heaviest hitters in the airline world. And the worst part? Everybody was watching. Aisha had put the video out there. Passengers caught every bit of it. The internet was going wild. The airline couldn't brush this off. Cassie stepped out of the cockpit and right away I saw it. She wasn't in charge anymore. People stared as she walked by. Some whispering, some glaring, some shaking their heads. Not a single person looked at her with any respect left. Jaden, Kyla, and Malik stayed put. Not victims now. They were the winners. Behind Cassie, Jim picked up the radio and talked to the cabin. From Horizon Airways, we're really sorry about today. We're taking this seriously and we'll handle it when we land. Some folks nodded, a few clapped. Not for the sorry, but because right had won out. I glanced at Robert Grayson, the guy who'd laughed at Jaden earlier. He sat stiff, staring at his drink, not looking up. Because now everybody knew who really belonged here. Cassie slipped off to the flight crew area. No more barking orders, no more acting big. She was just waiting for what was coming. Jaden leaned over to Kyla and Malik, saying something soft, and for the first time since we started, all 3 grinned. But I knew when we hit the ground, the real trouble would kick off, because Marcus Harris wasn't finished. What do you think's going to happen when we land? Will Cassie try to save her skin, or is this her job's end? Comment below and tell me where you're watching from. The captain's voice rang out in first class, letting us know we were dropping down to Los Angeles International Airport, but it wasn't like other flights, no calm feelings here. The quiet in the cabin wasn't cozy. It was everyone holding their breath, waiting for the big finish when things got made right. I glanced at Cassie. She was hunkered down in the crew spot, her face pale, her hands fidgeting like she was nervous. She knew what was waiting when we landed. She used to hold all the cards. Now she was the one sweating it out. Jaden, Kyla, and Malik sat still in their seats. 3 13-year-olds who'd been embarrassed in front of a bunch of strangers, now leaving this plane proud and tall. I could see Jaden relaxing. He knew this was when things got fair. But nobody knew what was really waiting for Cassie at the airport. Something way worse than she could guess. The plane touched down, and the heavy vibe grew thicker. Some people peeked out the windows, not to enjoy the view, but to spot who was down there, and then we saw them. As the plane rolled up to the gate, a bunch of official-looking folks were waiting. Not regular airport workers, but the people who call the shots. Leading them was William Bill Dawson, the boss of Horizon Airways, a guy with a lot of pull, known for tough rules and no patience for anything that messed up the company's name. Next to him were 2 higher-ups and some security guys. They weren't there to say hi to passengers, they were there to clean up a mess. The cabin door swung open. Nobody jumped up. Everyone just sat like this was a courtroom scene playing out. Jaden, Kyla, and Malik stayed put, watching. Cassie got up slow, heading toward the door like she was dragging her feet, hoping she could dodge what was next. But Bill Dawson was right there at the exit, his sharp eyes locked on her. "Cassandra Monroe," he said, his voice deep and in charge. Cassie stopped dead, her whole body going stiff when she heard her name. "I'm guessing you know why we're here." Cassie stumbled over her words, her voice weak for the first time this whole flight. I can clear this up." Bill crossed his arms. "You had plenty of time to clear things up. Instead, you misused your job, hurt innocent people, and dragged our airline's good name through the mud." Cassie tried to talk, but Bill held up a hand, shutting her down. "You're out. Fired. Starting now." First class went wild. Some clapped, others nodded like they agreed. Cassie stood there, shocked, like she couldn't believe it was real. She looked at Jim, her husband, but he didn't look back. No help, no words. Finally, Cassie hung her head and shuffled off the plane without a peep. Mark Hensley, the other crew guy who'd backed Cassie up, wasn't safe either. Bill turned to him. "You could have stopped this," Mark gulped. I was just doing what she said." Bill didn't let up. "You're getting a review. Discipline's coming." Nobody in first class argued. Everyone knew this was fair. When Cassie walked off, a big wave of calm washed over the cabin. No more stress, no more unfair junk. Jaden gave Kyla and Malik's hands one last squeeze, then smiled. They'd come out on top. Before heading off the plane, Bill turned to the triplets. "We're real sorry for what you went through." Then out of nowhere, he dipped his head to say sorry. Jaden looked him straight in the eye. "Just make sure nobody else has to deal with this." Bill took a quick breath, then nodded. "You've got my word." As I got off the plane, clapping filled the air. Not because someone got canned, but because people knew things had been made right. Aisha was still filming, but now she was smiling. "We just saw something pretty rare," she whispered to me. I nodded. "Yeah, and it's worth keeping in mind." The scene outside the gate felt different from a usual landing. It was where fairness landed. It was where fairness landed. I stepped out of first class, picking up a weird buzz from the crowd near the gate. Some folks were still chatting about what went down, while others scrolled their phones, eyes popping at what they saw. I looked ahead, and there he was, Marcus Harris. He stood there, cool and collected, his keen eyes checking out every passenger coming off. He didn't need to talk. Him being there said it all. Then Jaden, Kyla, and Malik stepped down, chins up. No scared looks, no second guessing. They'd taken back what nobody should have tried to take. Marcus walked up, pulling all three into a big, solid hug. For the first time since we took off, Jaden seemed like he could finally relax. "You kids all right?" Marcus asked, his voice low and caring. Jaden nodded. "We're okay, but I don't think this is over." Marcus looked at his son for a second, then nodded back. "You did what was right." That's the big thing. Kyla grabbed her dad's sleeve. "Dad, this won't happen to other people, will it?" Marcus got down on one knee, putting a steady hand on her shoulder. "I'll make sure it doesn't." I looked around and saw someone I recognized in the crowd, David Reynolds, a reporter guy who writes about fairness stuff, standing next to Aisha, who'd kept her camera rolling even after we landed. They swapped a few words before David turned to me, grinning. "Bet that was the wildest flight you've ever been on?" I laughed a little. "You got that right." David held up his phone, showing Aisha's video. It was everywhere, millions of views, tons of comments. Ours and Justice was the hottest thing on Twitter. "Looks like we started a huge talk about unfairness in flying," he said, flipping through posts. I peeked at some comments. "Can't believe this still goes on. Airlines need to own up." "I've had something like this happen. Thanks for speaking out." Marcus took a call, his face staying blank, but I could tell he was talking to the top dogs at Horizon. When he hung up, he turned to Bill Dawson, who was close by. "I don't want a sorry," he said flat out. "I want this fixed so it never happens again." Bill nodded. "You got my promise. We'll look at everything and change what's got to change." Marcus paused, then said, "I'll be keeping an eye on it." As we walked away from the gate, I saw this wasn't just about one flight anymore. Big news places like CNN, BBC, and the LA Times were all over it. People fighting for fairness were talking about problems in flying. Horizon Airways was getting hit hard by folks online, and money people to fix things for real. In just a few hours, what happened up there turned into something huge. Jaden turned to me. "You think they'll actually fix it?" I thought for a sec, then said, "If we keep making noise, they won't have a choice." Kyla squeezed her brother's hand, and for the first time, I saw a real spark in all three of their eyes. As I left the airport, I knew I'd just seen something that'd stick in flying history. Not just because a flight attendant got the boot, not just because an airline had to step up, but because fairness won and everybody saw it. What do you think this mess will do? Will airlines finally do something big after this blow-up? Comment below and let me know where you're watching from. This wasn't just one flight story anymore. It wasn't only about a flight attendant losing her job or an airline getting called out. We just watched a giant step toward fixing bigger problems. I pulled out my phone, checking the latest news. The buzz was still going strong, but what blew me away was how other airlines were getting dragged in too. It wasn't just Horizon Airways in the hot seat. Places like American Airlines, Delta, and United were catching heat online about how they deal with passenger gripes. A big meeting with airline bosses and groups fighting for passenger rights was set for next week. This showed one thing. This wasn't a one-off. It was a deep issue, and they couldn't dodge it this time. I found an article about Aisha Patel. She wasn't just the person who taped a video that went big. She turned into a symbol of holding people accountable. Tons of people followed her online, cheering her for standing up. She started something called Fly Fair, pushing airlines to be straight about how they treat folks. Airlines were getting nudged hard to fix how they handle complaints so power doesn't get twisted and unfair stuff stops. In a talk she did, Aisha said, "If I didn't catch that on camera, those kids would have been tossed off for nothing. I wasn't going to let that keep going." And she stuck to it. She wasn't just sharing tales. She was making a difference. Jaden was different now too. He wasn't just a 13-year-old who got pushed out of his seat. He'd stared down unfairness and made it his mission. In a news chat after it all, he said something that stuck with me. When something's not right, you can either sit there and take it or speak up and fix it. I pick speaking up. Then he surprised everyone. I want to study law when I'm older. I want to help people who can't fight for themselves. That's a big plan for a kid his age, but it meant a lot. Jaden had seen rules get bent, watched power get used to hurt people, and instead of just being ticked off, he decided to be the one to change it. I saw Marcus Harris looking at his son with a proud glint. Jaden didn't just get his own fairness back. He was getting ready to help others too. This whole thing started a ripple nobody saw coming. Airlines had to redo their rules inside to stop power grabs. Groups for passenger rights popped up to watch them closer. Jaden, Kyla, and Malik's story turned into a lesson on pushing back against unfair treatment. Most of all, tons of people around the world figured out they could ask for a better deal. Being there from the start, I felt good about seeing it happen. Good about watching fairness win out. I looked at Jaden, Kyla, and Malik, then at the news, the hot hashtags, and all the online chatter. We'd kicked off something new, and this was just the beginning. Will airlines really learn from this, or will it all slide back to how it was? Comment below and tell me where you're watching from. When I walked out of the airport that day, my head was still spinning from everything. What kicked off as a normal flight ended up as a huge lesson in doing what's right, being brave, and the strength of truth. I look back at Jaden, Kyla, and Malik Harris, 3 13-year-olds who got judged just for how they looked, treated like they didn't belong in first class. But in the end, they were the ones walking out strong, while the ones who misused their power slunk off in shame. This isn't just about a flight attendant getting sacked, it's proof of something way bigger. Fairness doesn't just happen, you've got to fight for it. Don't size people up by what's on the outside. Cassie saw these triplets and decided they didn't fit, didn't check their tickets, didn't look for facts, just made a call. But the truth showed something else. A person's real value isn't in their clothes, their age, or their place. It's in who they are, how honest they are, and how they treat folks. The big takeaway: don't let quick judgments keep you from seeing people straight. Fairness doesn't come from being in charge. It comes from how we act with each other. Marcus Harris was one of the biggest names in airlines, but he didn't throw his weight around to scare or settle scores. He used it to make sure right won out. But even with all his pull, this wouldn't have come out if people didn't speak up. Aisha, the other passengers, the ones who saw something wrong and wouldn't hush up. Real strength isn't with the top dogs, it's with the people who stand up for what's fair. Say something when you see wrong. Quiet lets bad stuff keep going. Picture if nobody taped that day, if nobody asked what was up, if everyone on the plane just ignored it. Jaden, Kyla, and Malik would have been kicked off with no noise, carrying a shame they didn't earn and nobody'd know. Cassie would have stayed on, sizing up others with her wrong ideas. But instead, one person spoke, then a couple, then the whole world. That's what speaking up does. Every time we say nothing about bad stuff, we let it roll on. But every time we step up even a little, we help make things better. Leaving the airport that day, one thing stuck in my mind. How many times have we seen something unfair and kept our mouths shut? How often have we watched someone get treated bad and thought, it's not our deal? But if Jaden hadn't held his ground, if Aisha hadn't filmed, if the passengers hadn't chimed in, fairness wouldn't have happened. So, I've got a question for you reading this. Have you ever seen something off and wished you'd said something? Tell me your story in the comments, and if you think fairness needs sticking up for, share this so more folks can pick up this big lesson.